The N13 is a 1.6 liter 4-cylinder turbocharged petrol engine with direct injection. You can find it in the BMW 1 Series F20 and in the 3 Series F30. To top of that, this engine was also available in some of the Mini Cooper models. In these cars it's known as the N18 and it has some minor modifications, from which the most obvious is a different position of the unit under the hood. To top of that, as most of you already know, this engine was developed not only by BMW but also by the French PSA group. So you can find this unit and its different variations in many different French cars as well. But to simplify the things, I will talk about only the N13 BMW version of this French-German engine. To look at the engine a bit more closely, it's important to remove the plastic engine cover. But keep in mind that there is a small vacuum tank built into this cover and there is also a vacuum line which goes into this tank. This means that if you don't unplug the line, you will break off the small connection piece on the tank and you will have to buy a new or a used engine cover. With the cover removed, you can see the ignition coils. They can of course fail together with the spark plugs, causing misfires, but that's nothing special. By the way, in this engine it's good to replace the spark plugs every 40,000 kilometers. Next, there is the valve cover. The first issue related to this part is the valve cover gasket, which can leak oil, but that's again nothing special and it's a cheap fix. The second issue on the other side is a bit special, since it's related to the PCV system. Under this small cover is the usual PCV membrane, which will crack over time, causing misfires and even excessive oil consumption. The PCV membrane itself is part of the valve cover, which is not cheap. But luckily, you can buy an aftermarket PCV membrane and replace it separately. This can solve the PCV issues, but sadly, not always. Not always, since the valve cover has two additional small valves built into it. So even if you replace the big PCV membrane itself, you can still sometimes experience the same PCV related issues because the two valves can be faulty or the channels in the cover can be clogged. In this case, you will have to replace the whole valve cover anyway, so in many cases it's simply not worth it to replace just the PCV membrane itself. Next, there is the turbocharger. The turbocharger itself is not known for premature failure, but on higher mileage cars or on the more abused cars, it can of course break. On the other side, what will definitely break prematurely is the stuff around the turbocharger. Specifically, the turbo intake hose often cracks near or under this metallic clamp. This can cause various symptoms, but in many cases you won't notice anything. However, if you are really unlucky, then there is a possibility that a piece of hose gets sucked into the turbocharger and destroy it. Another thing which will crack is this plastic pipe which connects the turbo intake hose to the PCV. This pipe gets brittle over time, so it's a good idea to replace it even preventively. Next, there is the turbo diverter valve, which is bolted to the turbocharger. This valve has a rubber membrane in it, which will crack over time, causing various power-related issues. But it's very easy to replace it, so you can consider replacing it preventively as well. Another possible issue is the failure of the turbo vacuum solenoid, causing power-related problems. This solenoid is located on the other side of the engine. It's well hidden specifically under the intake manifold, so it seems like the fastest way to replace it is from under the car. Lastly, there are two harmless but annoying issues related to the turbocharger. The metallic heat shield can start to rattle, and the turbo wastegate linkage can often rattle too. Now let's move on to the front of the engine. On the front you can find the alternator, AC compressor, the crank pulley, the water pump, the accessory belt tensioner pulley, and a thing called the friction wheel drive. The most interesting thing from all these is obviously this friction wheel thing. All you have to know about it is that it drives the water pump and it can fail, causing a specific metallic rattling noise. Then, on cars which are equipped with an automatic gearbox, it's very important to have the accessory belt and the associated parts in good condition. And why? Because if the belt breaks or shreds, then it can easily damage the automatic gearbox oil cooler lines, which are positioned very closely to this belt. In this case, the ATF fluid will obviously leak out, and if you don't notice this in time, then you will damage the gearbox itself as well. Next, it's good to know that there is an additional electric coolant pump in front of the engine which can fail or leak, so check it and be ready to replace it. That would be the front of the engine. Now let's move on to the more serious stuff, the timing chain. All of these engines are equipped with a timing chain which is mounted on the front. If you are lucky and if you don't have an early production engine, then the chain can last even 200,000 kilometers. But this is not a rule of thumb, so be ready to replace the whole mechanism at around 150,000 kilometers or even earlier. Why? Well, because at 150,000 kilometers, as on this example, the chain tensioner will be most probably pushed out too much already. The chain will be stretched and the plastic chain guides will start to wear out as well. If you ignore this, then the chain eventually jumps and in the worst case it destroys the engine. No big deal. But luckily, it is possible to actually measure the chain wear with a simple tool, which you insert instead of the chain tensioner. So I would highly recommend to measure the chain wear at least after 100,000 kilometers or after buying. Another possible serious issue of these engines is the excessive oil consumption. It can appear before 150,000 kilometers, but sometimes even before 100,000 kilometers. This issue can be caused by 5 things, basically. The simplest and cheapest cause is the faulty PCV. I already talked about it, so you will have to replace either just the membrane itself or the whole valve cover. The worn valve stem seals can often cause oil consumption too. This is easy to check, since in this case you will see blue smoke from the exhaust when you rev up the engine after idling for a while. The piston rings can cause oil consumption as well. They will simply clog up with carbon. This you can't really check, and to fix it you will have to disassemble the whole engine basically, which is not easy nor cheap. In the worst case, the oil consumption is caused by worn cylinder walls. This is the most expensive repair, since you will have to overhaul the whole engine or replace it completely. The only good thing about this is that you can check the cylinders with an endoscopic camera and hope for the best. And lastly, it seems like that a worn timing chain can cause oil consumption as well, because surprisingly, numerous owners got rid of oil consumption after replacing the timing chain. It seems like this phenomenon does have something to do with excess vacuum caused by bad timing or something, but honestly I don't care and I am not interested in looking into this anymore. Next, there are the various oil and coolant leaks, and this engine can leak from everywhere, literally. So, the valve cover gasket can leak, but I already mentioned this. Next, the O-ring of the upper turbo pipe will inevitably leak, but this is a cheap and easy repair too. By the way, there is also a lower turbo oil pipe which can most probably leak over time as well, because of the O-ring, of course. After this, there is the vacuum pump mounted on the back of the engine, which in many cases leaks oil as well. And in this case you will not only see the leak on the back of the engine, but most probably even smell burnt oil too. To fix this, just replace the vacuum pump. Another thing on the back of the engine which can leak is the oil pressure sensor. The sensor is bolted onto the oil filter housing and it can leak not only from the O-ring, but also internally from the pins. So if it's leaking, replace it completely. Next, there is the oil cooler, also mounted onto the oil filter housing. This can leak oil as well, but keep in mind that not all of these engines are equipped with an oil cooler. Some weaker versions don't have it. And then there is the oil filter housing itself. The gaskets of this housing are gonna inevitably fail and leak. The gaskets are cheap, but replacing them is not the easiest, since you have to remove part of the exhaust, the cat, to access the housing. Lastly, check the front of the engine for oil leaks as well, because the two metallic plugs can sometimes slightly leak oil, and the front crankshaft seal can leak too. Now, the coolant leaks. A very common coolant leak is caused by the coolant temperature sensor body located behind the engine. In this case, mostly just the O-ring of the coolant temperature sensor leaks, but there are two other gaskets which can leak too. You can buy the temperature sensor O-ring separately, but it's better to replace it together with the housing and the coolant hose. Another common coolant leak is caused by the two O-rings on the side of the turbocharger, but this is a very cheap and easy fix. Under the turbocharger there is a metallic coolant pipe which is connected to the engine block through this small metallic crosspiece. The O-rings on this connecting crosspiece will fail and leak, so be ready for this. Plus, to top of that, there is also a short rubber hose connected to the metallic coolant pipe, which can leak too. After this, there is the thermostat, which will leak and eventually fail. This part looks like a cheap plastic garbage which will inevitably crack and disintegrate, so be ready to replace it. To top of that, it's pretty hidden under the intake manifold on the side of the engine, so replacing it is not the easiest, since you have to remove the engine ECU plate, the intake manifold, plus obviously the small trash around. The water pump located on the front of the engine will fail too. In many cases, it usually just develops bigger play while making noises, but of course it can also leak, so check it. Lastly, keep in mind that sometimes the coolant tank itself cracks and leaks, plus it's good to replace the coolant tank cap preventively. Long story short, this cap also acts as a pressure relief valve, and this small mechanism in it can get stuck, which will cause excessive pressure in the cooling system, which will cause the various coolant leaks earlier than they would normally occur. To end this long list, there are a couple of last things related to these engines. So, the oil dipstick often breaks. The exhaust side venous solenoid valve can fail more often, causing various symptoms. However, there is also an intake venous solenoid on the other side of the engine, which can sometimes fail too. Throttle body failures can occur as well, causing various symptoms. The regular low-pressure fuel pump failures are also not uncommon, mainly in cars used in countries with bad quality fuel. But the relay of this pump can fail too. And lastly, since these engines are equipped with direct injection, you should expect issues with injectors, high-pressure fuel pump, and with carbon buildup. That would be it, I guess. And I know that it can look crazy.
This is crazy. This is crazy stuff.
By the way, I would recommend you to check out this movie, it's one of my favorites. But let's go back to the N13. This horrible looking list of problems doesn't mean that you will experience all of these issues, and definitely not at the same time. But it's still better to keep in mind that these are not the most reliable engines in the world, even though with proper maintenance you can minimize or even eliminate many of the issues. So, first of all, it's important to change the engine oil every 8,000 kilometers. Change the spark plugs every 40,000 or maximum 60,000 kilometers. Use premium fuel, eventually additives. Check, test, clean or simply replace the injectors at around 200,000 kilometers. But in countries with bad quality fuel, it's better to do this at around 100,000 kilometers. Check and eventually clean the intake valves from carbon every 100,000 or 120,000 kilometers. Check the timing chain wear at 100,000 kilometers or after buying. Keep in mind all the weak spots I mentioned in this exhausting video. And lastly, it's better to avoid engines with performance upgrades, since this tuning increases the risk of cracked pistons. Yes, this can occur too.